All right, we're ready for our next talk, and we are very honored to have the ex-Minister of Defense for Canada, a peace activist. Help me welcome the Honorable Paul Hellyer.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Alejandro. Reminds me of the small boy who fell headfirst into a barrel of molasses. And when they pulled him out, he licked some of the molasses from his face and said, "Lord, make my tongue adequate to this occasion." Now, that's probably the last giggle you'll hear for the next hour, because what I'm talking about is a very serious subject, in my opinion. I am not a ufologist, and I don't pretend to be, but I must say that I've enjoyed listening to so many excellent presenters the last few days and have learned a tremendous amount from them. And I'm very grateful to each and every one of them. I have made it clear, and this was accepted by open minds, that what I would do is, instead of talking specifically about the subject at hand, although it comes into my speech in context of what I want to say, that I would do a condensation of my book, which is really a sort of a worldview, a review of what is going on globally. And I've changed the subject of my speech from global turmoil, or world turmoil, to a global fraud, global hope. And mostly I'll be talking about the world financial system, which incidentally is the one subject that is less understood than the UFO phenomenon. I don't think it could get 1,000 people in the United States to come and hear about the financial situation, but I hope maybe we can stir up enough interest that the next time we can. But the world financial system is a total fraud. Fraud. It is one gargantuan Ponzi scheme, no better than the one Bernie Madoff used to swindle his friends and neighbors, and thousands of times worse if you add up the total number of victims it has ripped off over countless generations. The principal difference between the two schemes is that Madoff was acting outside the law, while the international banking cartel has persuaded generation after generation of monarchs, presidents, and prime ministers to provide legislative protection for their larceny. The bank's Ponzi scheme is very simple. They lend the same money to several people or institutions at the same time and collect interest from each one of them. It's nice work if you can get it, and you can get it if you have a bank charter. What the banks really lend, however, is their credit. And what they take back in compensation for that privilege is a debt that must be repaid with interest. The number of times that they lend the same money is called leverage. The practice is as old as the hills. But for our purposes, we can start with the goldsmiths of Lombard Street in London, England, who accepted deposits from their customers, and they issued certificates that were redeemable on demand. They paid their customers a nominal fee for the nominal interest rate on the deposits, on the understanding that they could lend the money to their customers at higher interest rates. They soon found that they could lend more than they had in their vaults because only a few depositors came in to redeem their gold or silver at any one time. It was a scam. It was illegal. Nevertheless, they got away with it for a long while, and the scam was legitimized when the Bank of England was chartered to help King William finance his war. Rich people subscribed £1,200,000 in gold and silver for the capital to establish the bank, and this was lent to the government at 8%, which is a pretty high rate of interest for a guaranteed loan. But then, to show his appreciation, the king allowed the bank to print £1,200,000 in banknotes and lend it at high interest to their friends. In effect, the bank was allowed to lend the same money twice, once to the government and once to the people. Over the years, due to the avarice of the banks and the collusion of politicians, that ratio has increased dramatically. In the early days of the 20th century, for example, federally chartered banks in the United States were required to keep a 25% gold deposit, gold backing for their deposits, and in effect, they were allowed to lend the same money 4 times. When I was younger, Canadian banks were required to keep a reserve of 8% cash, which allowed them to lend the same money 12.5 times. Today, thanks to Milton Friedman's irrational flip-flop from being a proponent of 100% cash reserves to the opposite extreme of zero reserves, and the adoption of his ideas by the major central banks of the world in 1974, multiples have increased dramatically, in some cases to as much as 20 to 1 or more. Banks only keep enough cash to meet day-to-day demands for those few customers who go in and request it. And consequently, the fraud is virtually total. The system works this way. Let's say you want to borrow $35,000 to buy a car. You go and see your friendly banker, and he or she will ask you for some collateral, some stocks or bonds, or second mortgage on your house or your cottage, or failing that, maybe the signature of a rich relative or a friend. And once the collateral is satisfied, they will ask you to sign a note for the principal plus interest, probably prime plus, so much, depending on the color of your eyes. And then they tap their computer, and presto, $35,000 appears in your account that you can go out and spend to buy the car. Seconds earlier, that money did not exist. It was created out of thin air, so to speak. Well, when the banking the way the banks make their money is what they call the spread. If you leave the money there for a while until maybe the new models come out or something like that, they'll pay you 0 or maybe 0.25% interest on it compared to the high interest rate on your note. And they make their money on the difference. The banking equation is a species of double-entry bookkeeping, where your note becomes an asset on the bank's books, and the new money that was deposited to your account is a liability. At some point, however, you have to pay back your note. You have to pay it off, plus the interest that's outstanding. And not only that, but everyone else who has borrowed from the banks, including governments, which, by the way, own the right to print money, but have irresponsibly, in my opinion, handed the right over to an elite group of private bankers. Anyone who defaults is in trouble. big trouble. Individuals who default will have the assets they pledged as collateral seized by the banks. Governments that are in danger of defaulting will be forced to borrow from the International Monetary Fund, which will then tell that government how to run its affairs, including cutting back on services and selling off public assets to the international vulture capitalists. In reality, then, the banks have turned the world into one humongous pawn shop. You hawk your stocks, bonds, house, business, rich mother-in-law, or country, and the banks will give you a loan based on the value of the collateral. A world system where all the money is created as debt is a perpetual disaster in the making. It is like a giant balloon that the banks keep blowing up and filling with debt until it gets so full that we can no longer carry the debt load. And then it's like a balloon with a pin stuck in it. The system crashes, and thousands and sometimes millions of innocent people lose their jobs, homes, farms, and businesses. Almost any high school student should be able to see that any monetary system based on debt creation is totally insane. The total world debt, mathematically, is always tending toward infinity. And there is no possible way of paying it off. The real money, that is legal tender, to pay it off just doesn't exist. And the real economy, Main Street, that depends on cash to grow, shifts into low gear whenever the supply of credit money dries up. Not surprisingly, there have been 25 recessions and depressions in the United States since 1890. In several cases, including the Great Depression of the 1930s, which I remember well, and the current Great Recession, the evidence indicates that the meltdown was anticipated by a few insiders who helped trigger the catastrophe. In the wake of the Great Depression, the U.S. Senate Banking and Currency Committee report, that became widely known as the Pecora Report, indicated that there were insiders who benefited from the crash. And I quote, "Legal chicanery and pitch darkness were the bankers' stoutest allies," Pecora wrote in his memoir. Similar allegations were evident in Charles Ferguson's damning documentary Inside Job, relating to the 2007-2008 meltdown. And if any of you haven't seen Inside Job and you can get a look at it, I would urge you to do so. These reports and other historical evidence prove beyond any doubt that much of Wall Street is rotten to the core. It has become one gigantic millstone around the neck of both the American and world economies. The collateral damage from the recent meltdown has been staggering. The U.S. Bureau of Labor estimated that 8.4 million jobs were lost in the U.S. alone. Most countries experience similar dramatic losses. The reduction in asset values worldwide has been estimated at 20 trillion U.S. dollars. Yet not a single one of the culprits is in jail. You would think that someone would have had the decency to launch a class action for at least 10 trillion against every individual and every organization that contributed to the catastrophe in any way. It boggles the mind that a system so vulnerable to manipulation would ever have come into existence in the first place. Well, as you might expect, the evolution did not happen by accident. It was not guided by the mythical, invisible hand of Adam Smith. On the contrary, For more than a century and a half, it was engineered by the barely visible hand of the Rothschild family and its allies. And since World War II, by the Rockefeller family. The two dynasties combined forces to exercise influence on many fronts, sheltered by the cloak of secrecy established by the Bilderberg Group. The long-term influence of the banking cartel is incalculable. Their biggest coup was the establishment of the Federal Reserve System in the United States. The big New York banks really didn't like the idea of genuine competition. So a small group held a secret meeting at the private resort of J.P. Morgan on Jekyll Island, off the coast of Georgia. Their scheme, devised by Paul M. Warburg and subsequently adopted by Congress, is a legal private monopoly of the U.S. money supply, operated for the benefit of the few under the guise of protecting and promoting the public interest. It is a tribute to the skill of the international bankers that they were able to draft a bill, revise it, change its name, and make the few window-dressing compromises necessary to get it adopted by Congress just before Christmas, when quite a few representatives must have been dreaming of sugar plum fairies instead of exercising due diligence. Only Charles Lindbergh Sr. seemed to grasp the significance of what was going on. To put it bluntly, the Congress transferred its sovereign constitutional right to create money to the sole custody of a group of private bankers. The magnitude of the hoist is unprecedented in the history of the world. The numbers now are in the high trillions. Soon after the bill was passed, the magnitude of the tragedy began to be recognized. Williams Jennings Bryan, who acted as Democrat whip, later said, and I quote him, "In my long political career, the one thing I genuinely regret is my part in getting the banking and currency legislation, that's the Federal Reserve Act of 1913, enacted into law." End of quote. President Woodrow Wilson, just 3 years after passage of the act, wrote, and I quote him, "A great industrial nation is controlled by its system of credit. Our system of credit is concentrated in the Federal Reserve System. The growth of the nation, therefore, and all of our activities are in the hands of a few men. We have come to be one of the worst ruled, one of the most completely controlled and dominated governments in the civilized world." But the bill was not repealed. Almost 100 years later, the sellout is still the law. This makes you wonder what the people's representatives have been doing to earn their salaries. The people in charge of the original deception were very far-seeing. They realized that when future governments had to borrow from them, they would need a constant stream of income to pay the interest on the bonds. So they pursued the government to introduce income taxes, first as temporary measures, but later permanently, so that it would be possible for the government to meet its obligations to the bondholders. In fiscal year 2005, total individual income taxes in the U.S. totaled $927 billion. Of that amount, $352 billion, or 38%, was required just to pay interest on the federal debt. The figure would be much higher now. The banksters, as they were often called at the time, then decided that an independent press might catch on to the chicanery. Oscar Callaway is reported in the Congressional Record of February the 9th, 1917, as follows, and I quote, "In March 1915, the J.P. Morgan interests, the steel, shipbuilding, and powder interests and their subsidiary organizations, got together 12 men high up in the newspaper world and employed them to select the most influential newspapers in the United States, and sufficient number of them to control generally the policy of the daily press of the United States. They found it was only necessary to purchase the control of 25 of the greatest papers. The 25 papers were agreed upon. Emissaries were sent to purchase the policy, national and international, of these papers. An editor was furnished for each paper to properly supervise and edit information regarding the questions of preparedness, militarism, financial policies, and other things of national and international nature, the ones that were considered vital to the interests of the purchasers, and in brackets, and to suppress everything in opposition to the wishes of the interests served, end of quote. It has been suggested that the Bilderberger Group may have taken a leaf from the Morgan precedent to protect their interests in the late 20th and early 21st centuries. That is impossible to prove because its members are sworn to secrecy and the press won't report on its meetings. Could it be mere coincidence that the monetary system, the downside of globalization, and the decades-long cover-up of the extraterrestrial presence and technology, especially the clean energy sources that would impact the value of oil stocks, the three subjects most directly beneficial interest to the banksters, are the three subjects that the mainline press have avoided like the plague. Well, I'm not willing to go so far as to say that the men behind the international banking system are evil men, because their thoughts are private. But Sir Josiah, later Baron Stamp, a former director of the Bank of England, has given us a rare snapshot of the truth. Banking, he said, and I'm quoting him, was conceived in iniquity and was born in sin. The bankers own the earth. Take it away from them, but leave them the power to create money, and with a flick of a pen, they will create enough money to buy it back again. However, take that power away from them, and all the great fortunes like mine will disappear. And they ought to disappear, for the world would be a happier and better place to live in. But if you wish to remain the slaves of bankers and pay the cost of your own slavery, let them control and continue to create money. On the latest meltdown of 2007-2008, the Fed acted quickly to prevent the Ponzi pyramid from collapsing completely. It printed trillions of dollars to bail out the banks and a few industries that were highly indebted to the banks. But what did the Fed do for the taxpayers, whose money was so wildly diluted to save the banks? Nothing. They were left to fend for themselves. Millions of people lost their jobs, their farms, their houses, their hopes, and their dignity, all as a result of circumstances beyond their control. The taxpayers bailed out the banks, but got nothing in return. The same is true of governments, who came so quickly to the rescue. As a result of the meltdown, their revenues were decreased, so they were forced to incur or increase their deficits, as well as to start cutting back on essential services, something I was reading about in this morning's New York Times. The Fed pretended to be helping stimulate the economy by reducing interest rates to near zero. It would be an interesting exercise to find out how much of that low-cost money went where. What was it spent for? It would certainly be a good subject for congressional attention. How much did the banks use to buy up domestic and foreign assets at fire sale prices? Was any of it used by financial institutions to try to corner world food markets and raise prices at a time when millions of people are starving? Well, no doubt some taxpayers did take advantage of the low interest rates, but were they warned about the old bait and switch game? Anyone who acquires assets with cheap money runs the risk of losing their property when the Fed ultimately raises rates. It's all part of the boom-bust cycle inherent in our infinitely silly monetary system. What does this have to say about the economics profession? What it really says isn't fit to print. Someone said that if you put 20 economists in a room, you will get 21 opinions. That is not my experience. If you get 20 economists together, they are likely to give you one stock answer, or at most two. And if there is one dissenter, he or she is likely to be drowned out by the 19, squawking like a flock of parrots the words memorized from their professors' mouths. Well, I have witnessed the herd-like mentality firsthand. When I was first elected to the House of Commons in 1949, there were only a handful of Keynesians in Ottawa. 20 years later, everyone was a Keynesian, including, I am told, Richard Nixon. At that time, there were only a few monetarists around, but they spread like mushrooms and soon dominated the economic landscape. It reached the stage where Keynes was anathema, and it was almost impossible to get a tenured position in a school of economics unless you were part of Milton Friedman's monetarist revolution. Apparently, little, if any, thought was given to the possibility that neither Keynes nor Friedman had got it right. The former was a bit closer to reality than the latter, but both theories foundered on the rocks of one inescapable truth. Both assumed that the economic system is self-correcting. Yet more than 2 centuries of experience has demonstrated clearly that it is not. Someone has to be at the tiller, charged with steering clear of the shoals and rocks of economic disaster. And that person has to be someone who is responsible to the people and not the self-governing, self-serving boom-busters. While bank reform is the most urgent problem facing the world today, it is global warming that has equally or even greater long-term consequences. It is a total fraud to pretend that we have 30, 40, or 50 years to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. There are reputable scientists who think that we have already crossed the Rubicon. Even if that is true, we can't roll the clock back. We can only influence the present and the future. Each of the past 3 decades has been the hottest on record. According to a report released in July 2010 by the U.S. National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, all of the indicators are worrisome. And that included data measured by 160 research groups in 48 countries. The data shows that sea levels are rising. Snow cover in the Arctic melts earlier. The average air temperature is rising. Ocean surface temperatures have been rising also. The summer sea ice is declining. Sea air temperatures have been rising. For 19 years, glaciers have lost mass. Land air temperature has also been rising, and this is all a global trend. All of this puts the lie to the propaganda of the oil industry aimed at creating doubt about the reliability of the scientific data. Taking a leaf from the tobacco industry, which managed to create doubt about the safety of their products years after they privately knew the facts, the oil industry has been attempting to raise doubt about the urgency of replacing fossil fuels with clean energy. And with considerable success, I regret to say. In their case, however, the stakes are higher. It was a tragedy that so many people lost their lives through lack of sound information about the consequences of smoking. In the case of global warming, however, many times more people will have their lives put at risk. Still, the oil cartel is making plans as if nothing was going to change, and that we are going to be stuck with a fatal oil economy for decades until the damage is irreversible. Well, let me say, it is too late for more offshore drilling. It is too late for new developments in the Alberta oil sands. It is too late for more noisy windmill farms. The transition must start now with a 10-year deadline. Is that possible? Of course it's possible, but only with the kind of mobilization essential to win a war for survival, which is really what we're talking about. One excuse for inaction has been the lack of money due to government deficits and debt. But that obstacle can be overcome in less than a year if governments and legislatures change the system and exercise their sovereign right to make what is physically possible financially possible. Heaven knows there are millions of unemployed people, workers worldwide, just waiting to rise to the challenge. The other major obstacle has been a lack of consensus on the form of clean energy to use to replace the fossil fuel economy. And that brings me finally to the subject of the day, the extraterrestrial presence and technology. It is a fraud for the government to pretend that it is not interested in UFOs. In fact, as most of you know, it has been a matter of high and probably preeminent interest for decades. As Richard Dolan told us, I think it was yesterday, an early Canadian ufologist, Wilbert Smith, who was a senior employee at the Department of Transport, where I later became minister, not long before I actually arrived there, wrote a top-secret memorandum to the Controller of Communications, dated November 21st, 1950, asking permission to set up a group to study the geomagnetic aspects of UFOs' propulsion systems. And as part of the memorandum, Smith said that he had made discreet inquiries through the Canadian Embassy staff in Washington, and he had obtained the following information: that the matter is the most highly classified subject in the United States government, rating higher even than the H-bomb. Flying saucers exist. Their modus operandi is unknown, but a concentrated effort is being made by a small group headed by Dr. Vannevar Bush. The entire matter is considered by the United States authorities to be of tremendous significance. So, Dr. Vannevar Bush, who was one of America's preeminent scientists at the time, and a team of experts he had assembled, were already working on back engineering by 1950. Many people who are interested in the subject of UFOs use one of the Roswell crashes of July 1947 as their starting line. Recent evidence, however, confirms that the U.S. Army Air Corps was in the crash retrieval business even before that. Paula Harris, on July the 5th, 2010, interviewed two men, Jose Padilla and Remy Baca, who were aged 9 and 7 at the time, who witnessed a saucer crash on Padilla land near San Antonio, New Mexico, in August of 1945. In her new book, Exopolitics, Stargate to a New Reality, Paula gives the detailed account of what these men saw as children. The actual crash, the creature's appearance, the pieces of the craft that they took, the military cleanup, and an in-depth analysis of the significance of the case. Well, I had the opportunity to chat with Remy Baca by telephone recently, and the thing that stuck in my mind was that when Sergeant Avila came to ask Mr. Padilla permission to enter his land to retrieve the object, quote unquote, he referred to it as, quote, an experimental weather balloon. Doesn't that sound familiar? That was exactly the same ruse that Brigadier General Roger Ramey used in reference to the Roswell incident 2 years later. Apparently, there was a considerable lack of imagination on the Army's part. In later years, the Air Force that had succeeded the Army Air Corps became much more sophisticated in its misinformation and disinformation techniques. These include having the star visitors portrayed in movies as sinister beings that we should be fearful of, probably without justification. Another fascinating case that Paula brought to my attention not long ago was that of Charles Hall, the physicist and information technology professional who worked as an airman meteorologist at the USAF bombing and gunnery range at Indian Springs, Nevada in the 1960s. Charles worked in close contact with tall whites, a species that I had been previously unfamiliar with. And over a period of months, he learned to lose his fear of the aliens who lived, worked, and played on Air Force property. In a 2-hour telephone conversation, he gave me many of the characteristics of the whites, described the scout ships in which they traveled around, and said most of them had been assembled in the United States. Furthermore, he talked about the mothership arriving on the nights of the full moon and sliding into its hangar cut into the side of a mountain nearby. It was all fascinating stuff that included the fact that the tall whites were working closely with the USAF on exchanging technology in the mid-1960s. So it is very difficult to imagine how much has been achieved in 60 years of back engineering. There is no doubt that myriad scientists, technicians, and many of America's most advanced aircraft and weapons corporations must have achieved what would have been classified as miracles just a few years ago. As Michael Schratt demonstrated clearly Thursday morning, that is the case. And as interesting as S4 is, with its special designation, it isn't the only installation, as you well know. There are others, and there are a lot of things that we still don't know. It is probably a fact that U.S. engineers working in one of the vast underground facilities have built vehicles that are virtually indistinguishable from those of other planets. Now what we want to know is to what purpose they will be put. Will it be for good purposes or military purposes? Could I have a little glass of water, please? The area of discovery that is most relevant to this presentation, however, is the question of exotic energy sources. Years ago, it was reported that both zero-point and cold fusion energy had been developed. These are energy sources that could facilitate the 10-year target date and not only revolutionize the world for the better, but help preserve it as a happy habitat for Earthlings. Who's down here? Thank you. In the unlikely event that these sources are not yet commercially viable, all we would have to do is ask one of the friendly species to help us, and they would certainly do that because they are deeply concerned about our stewardship of our planet. In the event that we are still treating them as enemy aliens and doing our best to shoot them down, we would have to curb our lust of conflict and adopt an acceptable level of intergalactic civility. The third essential change is for us as individuals. A just and peaceful world is not possible when it is riddled with graft, fraud, and corruption of all kinds. Greed is king, and mammon rules the world. Institutions have to change too. For centuries, major religions have been selling their alleged superiority or exclusiveness at the point of a sword, leading to the deaths of thousands of innocents. The three Abrahamic religions, for example, all claim the inside route to paradise. Mathematically, that is impossible. It is far more probable, mathematically, that they are all wrong and that the truth is larger and much more inclusive. Ancient and modern history both suggest that there is no hope of a just and peaceful world unless all religions and those with no religion forget their differences and start working together to build the kingdom of God on earth. And I define this as a world where every child can expect food to eat, clean water to drink, adequate clothing, a roof overhead, access to medical support, and enough education to be able to determine how best he or she can serve humankind positively with dignity and self-fulfillment. What a wonderful world that would be. But it would require a 180-degree change in policies and priorities, and a serious effort to apply the golden rule that all religions claim as a common thread. The application of the golden rule would mean an end to empire building and the pursuit of military power and advantage. The U.S., for example, would have to stop being its own worst enemy. The declaration of war on terror was the biggest strategic blunder I have ever seen. On the 11th day of September 2001, following the attacks on the World Trade Center, the United States enjoyed the sympathy of the world, including Arab states and populations. The threat from al-Qaeda was limited and quite within the potential of police and intelligence operations to cope with. The situation changed dramatically with the launch of a war on Iraq. The goodwill began to evaporate overnight. Soon, instead of a few dozen insurgents, the number of young Muslims willing to die for their cause multiplied to thousands, and a great chasm of hate and mistrust enveloped much of the world. The U.S. has consistently refused to be even-handed in the Israeli-Palestinian dispute. And the Israelis deceive themselves and the world when they claim to be the victims. For a long while, peace has been within their grasp if they could have agreed to a just settlement and establishment of a vibrant Palestinian state. But a handful of fundamentalists have always succeeded in disrupting the peace process because they are not willing to accept the great Rabbi Hillel's admonition, and I quote, "So always treat others the way you would want them to treat you. That is the message of the law and the prophets. Meanwhile, the peace and stability of the world remain in jeopardy. The world community must adopt principles and practices that override fundamentalism of any stripe, whether it be Christian, Muslim, Jewish, or economic. In addition, religious people should pay more attention to their holy books. There is nothing in the Bible that would legitimize a preventive war with its carpet bombing, or the launch of a drone or missile intended to kill one person when there is risk that innocent bystanders will also die. Similarly, there is nothing in the Quran that would justify suicide bombing that result in the random death of innocents. Now, if you get the impression that the world is going to hell in a handbasket, you have read me correctly. But, and here's the good news, it doesn't need to be so. There are remedies, but they involve massive change in the areas discussed, none of which are even on the political radar at present. There is light at the end of the tunnel, but, as Sir John Quinton, the former chairman of Barclays Bank, said, bankers sometimes look on politicians as people who, when they see light at the end of the tunnel, order more tunnel. What we are really talking about is restoring democracy to countries that not only claim that they have it, but also take pride in trying to export it, even though they don't really qualify as democratic as defined in the dictionary. In Webster's, it is government, and I quote, government in which supreme power is vested in the people and exercised by them or their elected representatives, end of quote. Well, to begin, Wall Street has been the dominant power in the U.S. for decades and still is. Add to that the fact that the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces, the President of the United States, does not have the security clearance for a number of projects controlled by troops under his command, and you have to conclude that the U.S. may not qualify as a democracy under the dictionary definition. The same can be said about Canada, the United Kingdom, Germany, and myriad countries that are really puppets of the international financial system. In each case, the real interests of citizen voters is subjugated to the demands of international finance. Well, there is a sad irony in reading U.S. history of the pre-revolutionary and revolutionary days. Historians often attribute the revolution to the tax on tea. On the other hand, Benjamin Franklin, in his memoirs, cited restrictions upon paper money as one of the main reasons for the alienation of the American provinces from the mother country. The U.S. won the Revolutionary War, but then lost the next critical one when it adopted the British banking system, instead of pursuing the better model their provinces had been experimenting with. For the U.S. to now inflict the British practice on countries around the world, using the International Monetary Fund and World Bank as enforcers, is comparable to the King's Edict that gave birth to the United States. So the chains of oppression have to be broken and freedom restored to citizens everywhere in the world. It's time to forget the Tea Party and address the critically important issues facing the U.S. and the world. All of these are issues that are nonpartisan by definition and deserve the attention and support of all genuine patriots without distinction of race, color, religion, or political affiliation, both in the U.S. and worldwide. We must unite, as Carol Rosin told us. We must unite to preserve and enhance the beautiful satellite that is our birthright. Well, here is an agenda for action. The first and most urgent project is to clip the wings of the bankers and democratize the money creation function. In the United States, the Federal Reserve System must be abolished and its alleged function of regulating the money supply be assumed by the federal government or an agency under its direct control. The most powerful and valuable tool in the economic arsenal must be available to the representatives of the people who can be held responsible for their success or failure. Well, some monetary reformers recommend that government create 100% of new money in a debt-free form comparable to greenbacks or something like that. In the interest of a fast and smooth transition, I am suggesting that a ratio of 34% government-created money to 66% bank-created money would work satisfactorily. Banks would be required to maintain 34% cash reserves against their deposits. The important thing is that governments must immediately create the large sums necessary to balance their budgets and get their economies running at maximum output again. And I am talking about an infusion of perhaps $10 trillion equivalent to start, and more if necessary, to get economies up to speed and to reduce unemployment worldwide by at least half with the creation of millions of new jobs. Is this likely to cause massive inflation, as the financial cartel will immediately allege, because it is one of its longest-running and most successful bugbearers? Well, the answer to their phony phonetics is a resounding no. As any economist should know, it is the amount of money that is created that influences prices and not who prints it. So as long as government limits what the economists call the multiplier effect, there will be no problem. Certainly the present system has been inflationary. A 1950 US dollar is only worth 7.5 cents today. A common sense monetary policy should produce better results than that. So there is no reason why the banking system should not be fundamentally reformed at once. There are four other actions that I think we, the people of the world, should demand of our politicians. A law must be passed at once to prohibit all politicians, candidates for political office, and political parties from accepting money from any financial institution. As well as make it a criminal offense for any such institution, either directly or indirectly, to offer it. World leaders must adopt a 10-year time frame to reduce greenhouse emissions by 90%. That will only be possible if the United States discloses its knowledge of the ET presence and technology and what has been accomplished in 60 years of back engineering, at least in the field of energy. The UN should declare 2012 the year of forgiveness and reconciliation, a new era of cooperation and, using the Greek word agape, love, between races, tribes, religions, nations, and regions, both mondial and intergalactic. We have so much to learn from our star visitors in many areas, including medicine and food production. So the U.S. must relinquish its privileged position as the center of the loop as part of a new kind of leadership, leading the world in creating the better world that we all dream of. Now, none of this vision of a just and peaceful world will be possible unless the all-pervasive powers of the international banks have been broken. In 1999, I wrote a book in which I said the next world war would be between the banks and the people of the world. There have been skirmishes for centuries, and so far the banks have always come out on top. They are now taking advantage of the recent meltdowns and the resulting sovereign debt crisis to line up their heavy artillery, including the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the Federal Reserve System, and the Bank for International Settlements for a final conclusive battle. As always, the aim of the game is to rob the people of the world of their sovereign right to govern their own affairs and to entrench the power of the international banks, their elite industrial allies, and a small cabal of military and intelligence insiders who run the world as their private fiefdom. The word unjust is too small a word by far to describe what they're up to. If any skeptics think I am overstating the case, don't take my word for it. Go to www.victoryfortheworld.net and read some of the books that can be used as references. 100 pages of The Web of Debt, for example, setting out the history of money, will probably be enough to make you sick at your stomach. I stopped reading it at night because it often made me so angry I couldn't sleep. Well, I entered politics more than 60 years ago because I thought recessions and depressions were quite unnecessary. They were monetary phenomena with a relatively easy fix. I have made hundreds of speeches on the subject and convinced a few thousand people, but never the movers and shakers. And the mainline press were less than helpful. They were so jaundiced that they were not interested in a maverick speaking truth to power. So it was always a case of David versus Goliath, to use a biblical analogy. Now, for the first time, the power exists to turn the tables and go for the jugular. The internet is providing power to the people that they have never enjoyed before. The young people of the world, in concert with the thousands of their parents and others who care about the state of the world, can use the power of social networking to effect a miracle on their own behalf and that of succeeding generations. The valiant people of Tunisia and Egypt have shown the way by achieving what was believed to be impossible. We share their euphoria. At the same time, they and we must acknowledge that it is only the beginning. Real freedom will only be possible when they have escaped from the tyranny of international banks, and Wall Street is no longer able to manipulate the price of their daily bread. Thank you. A good start might be to distribute perhaps 1 million copies of this speech and translate it into a number of languages. Then the rising generation can bombard the barricades through their social networks. Regime change is not necessary except for leaders who refuse to see the light. But concerned citizens of the world should band together and rattle the cages of all federal politicians. Tell them bluntly that they must vigorously support the above agenda or face inevitable defeat at the next election. It is a simple message, but it is the only one that they understand. At a press conference on March 29, 2001, announcing that the U.S. was backing out of the Kyoto Protocol, President George W. Bush said, quote, "A friend is someone who tells you the truth," end of quote. Well, that is what I've been doing today. It is a message of global hope for every race, color, religion, and nationality in the world, and of peaceful relations with visitors from other realms. Thank you. I think I have about 10 or 12 minutes left, and I'd be happy to take questions if some of you would like to have me elaborate a little bit.
Is this mic live? Yes. I have a question. Recently, I've read some interesting data on global warming that indicates that human activity accounts for less than 1% of the total warming on the planet, that the sun and the sun cycles are totally dominant. And anecdotally, I would like to mention that a professor at CU recently told me that he had done considerable deep core drilling and found no correlation between the carbon content of the atmosphere and the ambient temperatures. So I'm going to suggest that there may be another global conspiracy going on here, which is that the governments want to control the economy and humanity through this effort.
If I believed that, I wouldn't be here. And I would recommend a book called The Floods of Our Grandchildren by James Hansen. And I think anybody who reads it, it's a heavy read, but if you read it through, you'll be convinced this is the number one facing the globe at the present time. And sure, there's some heating from the sun, which is affecting other planets. We can't do anything about that. All we can do is change what we do, and that is what I think we have to do right away.
And what about the releases from ClimateGate and all of the secret memos that prove that data was manipulated?
I'm sorry, I can't give credence to...
Amidst all the negative news and talk, which is certainly true and justified, I'd just like to have you comment on the revolution in South America in the financial system and human rights. They have finally, except for perhaps Colombia and Peru, gone to leaders that are truly representative of the people and are eschewing the IMF and the associated financial institutions that you spoke about.
Good.
Would you care to comment on that, or
comment on
do you have anything to say about that? I mean, do you think it's a beacon for the rest of the world to look at?
I'm sorry, I'm having difficulty hearing. Maybe the reverberations. I don't know whether I can continue this or not. I'll put another earplug in here and see if I can. What was it again?
Just the revolutions that's taken place in South America in terms of kicking out the IMF and the World Bank and creating their own financial system and led by Chavez and Evo Morales and I think that's a hope for the world.
Yeah, I would say more power to them. I'll take two more questions and then
I was hoping that Open TV can release the copyright of your speech so we can just copy and spread it around.
What I'm going to do, if you go to this website, we'll put the speech up on the website so that you can download it. And if you want to spread it, if you think it's worth spreading, if every one of you would download the speech and send it to 10 people and ask them to send it to 10 more, it only takes 4 steps until we get up to the 1 million people, and then you're likely to get the real change in the world that you're looking for.
I'm currently reading The Web of Debt, which is basically saying the same things that you're saying right now, you know. I don't know if you're familiar with the book. I assume you are, you know.
Yeah, that's the book I was referring to.
Oh, was it?
Ellen Brown.
Do you discuss this in your book, Light at the End of the Tunnel, or are you doing another book related to the banking?
Pardon me?
Do you discuss this banking situation in Light at the End of the Tunnel?
Yeah, I do.
You do?
Yeah.
Are you doing any other book that you're going to concentrate more on this?
Sorry?
Are you going to do another book concentrating more on the banking?
No, there's one book already that I republished recently called A Miracle in Waiting.
Oh.
And it's listed in the list on the...
Is that for sale here?
No, it's not for sale here, but you can get it from Amazon or from Barnes & Noble or whoever.
All right, thank you.
A Miracle in Waiting, and it's the one on economics. This one is more global, and it has one chapter on the subject of... This is the one I'm talking about is www.victoryfortheworld.net.
Can you speak about the responsibilities that Canada has taken in this mess and what you think that they are able to do? Canada, what responsibility do they have in this and role are they playing in this?
Well, they're as bad as anybody in the world. And certainly on this, we don't take the question of global warming seriously. And we're a very bad example there. We go along with the States and Australia and some of the others that are foot-dragging and have been for a long time.
Thank you.
Aren't economic downturns planned by the government? And what's with all the gold being sold?
It's not. They're not planned by the government. As I tried to point out, that often it's been the financial people, the bankers, who have triggered economic recessions, and some of them, just a few, the elite ones, benefit from it at the expense of the others that buy up the small banks and they buy up the assets at low prices and so on. They're the ones with the incentive. Okay, well, I think that's enough questions. Thank you very much. I'm going to be outside autographing books. If anybody is interested, why, come out and I'll be glad to autograph your book for you.
All right, we're ready for our next talk, and we are very honored to have the ex-Minister of Defense for Canada, a peace activist. Help me welcome the Honorable Paul Hellyer.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Alejandro. Reminds me of the small boy who fell headfirst into a barrel of molasses. And when they pulled him out, he licked some of the molasses from his face and said, "Lord, make my tongue adequate to this occasion." Now, that's probably the last giggle you'll hear for the next hour, because what I'm talking about is a very serious subject, in my opinion. I am not a ufologist, and I don't pretend to be, but I must say that I've enjoyed listening to so many excellent presenters the last few days and have learned a tremendous amount from them. And I'm very grateful to each and every one of them. I have made it clear, and this was accepted by open minds, that what I would do is, instead of talking specifically about the subject at hand, although it comes into my speech in context of what I want to say, that I would do a condensation of my book, which is really a sort of a world view, a review of what is going on globally. And I've changed the subject of my speech from global turmoil, or world turmoil, to global fraud, global hope. And mostly I'll be talking about the world financial system, which incidentally is the one subject that is less understood than the UFO phenomenon. I don't think it could get 1,000 people in the United States to come and hear about the financial situation, but I hope maybe we can stir up enough interest that the next time we can. But the world financial system is a total fraud. Fraud. It is one gargantuan Ponzi scheme, no better than the one Bernie Madoff used to swindle his friends and neighbors, and thousands of times worse if you add up the total number of victims it has ripped off over countless generations. The principal difference between the two schemes is that Madoff was acting outside the law, while the international banking cartel has persuaded generation after generation of monarchs, presidents, and prime ministers to provide legislative protection for their larceny. The bank's Ponzi scheme is very simple. They lend the same money to several people or institutions at the same time and collect interest from each one of them. It's nice work if you can get it, and you can get it if you have a bank charter. What the banks really lend, however, is their credit. And what they take back in compensation for that privilege is a debt that must be repaid with interest. The number of times that they lend the same money is called leverage. The practice is as old as the hills. But for our purposes, we can start with the goldsmiths of Lombard Street in London, England, who accepted deposits from their customers, and they issued certificates that were redeemable on demand. They paid their customers a nominal fee for the nominal interest rate on the deposits, on the understanding that they could lend the money to their customers at higher interest rates. They soon found that they could lend more than they had in their vaults because only a few depositors came in to redeem their gold or silver at any one time. It was a scam. It was illegal. Nevertheless, they got away with it for a long while, and the scam was legitimized when the Bank of England was chartered to help King William finance his war. Rich people subscribed £1,200,000 in gold and silver for the capital to establish the bank, and this was lent to the government at 8%, which is a pretty high rate of interest for a guaranteed loan. But then, to show his appreciation, the king allowed the bank to print £1,200,000 in banknotes and lend it at high interest to their friends. In effect, the bank was allowed to lend the same money twice, once to the government and once to the people. Over the years, due to the avarice of the banks and the collusion of politicians, that ratio has increased dramatically. In the early days of the 20th century, for example, federally chartered banks in the United States were required to keep a 25% gold deposit, gold backing for their deposits, and in effect, they were allowed to lend the same money 4 times. When I was younger, Canadian banks were required to keep a reserve of 8% cash, which allowed them to lend the same money 12.5 times. Today, thanks to Milton Friedman's irrational flip-flop from being a proponent of 100% cash reserves to the opposite extreme of zero reserves, and the adoption of his ideas by the major central banks of the world in 1974, multiples have been